series of 4 lectures on the papacy. The lectures, of course, couldn't cover 266 popes in 2,000 years of history, but we were able to cover some of the important popes, and we have some very important ones today. Today's lecture will be from the Reformation to the modern day. I also promised a reading list, so I have that. We can pass that out, and there should be plenty for everybody. You could just pick and choose some of these works if you'd like to continue reading on these. Some of the topics that we couldn't get into, like encyclical letters and church councils, I'm thinking of doing some lectures in the next season on the church councils and on encyclical letters, so we can go into depth. And also I'm thinking of doing like a full lecture on individual popes that made a big difference throughout history, so that we can continue to learn about these things here, because this is more like an outline. So we have an ambitious agenda today also. Let's see. Pope Leo Pope Leo X. He is the first of 4 Medici popes. The Medicis were, I guess some of you might be familiar with them, very famous Florentine family. They were a banking family, and they were great sponsors of some of the great artworks and some of the great artists during the Renaissance. This Leo X was the son of Lorenzo de' Medici. And his name was Giovanni de' Medici. He was the second son of Lorenzo de' Medici. And Lorenzo prevailed on his relative, who happened to be Pope Innocent VIII, to name his son a cardinal. And Giovanni was made a cardinal, a deacon, when he was only 13 years old. Not uncommon in those days. Last week we talked about putting yourself in the context of the time. Now I want to just follow up on that by giving you something contextual. In those days in Europe, they had that system of primogeniture where the first son inherited everything. And that was important for the nobility because they had a lot to leave to their sons. But that meant that the second and third sons were dispossessed. So in those days, there just weren't that many professions to pursue. So they would take the second and third sons and send them to convents or monasteries for their education, and also buy simony, church offices for them. It was not uncommon. We talked a little about some of the abuses in the churches in the Middle Ages, like simony, buying church offices, lay investiture, and that. And here's a typical case. The Medicis were notorious for that. Just trying to take care of their sons, and this was just how life was in those days. So Giovanni de' Medici, I'm not sitting here in judgment of him, but he probably shouldn't have been where he was at the time. But he wasn't really what you consider a bad pope, but he wasn't a good pope, and he was the wrong person at the wrong time in history. Okay. By the way, his first cousin would also follow him in the papacy, and he also was elevated at a very young age. We'll talk about him in just a minute. Okay. He was also a dedicated patron of the arts. He continued the work that we spoke about last week that Pope Julius II had commissioned, rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica, the new basilica, the painting of the Raphael, the 5 rooms of Raphael, another Michelangelo painting the Sistine Chapel. All those projects were going on, and Leo continued them, right? Because he took over after Julius II had died. In 1510, Martin Luther, who was an Augustinian monk teaching theology in Germany at the University of Wittenberg, was sent by his order, the Augustinian order, to go to Rome. And in Rome, he was scandalized. There's a priest from northern Germany living an austere life, trying to lead a good Christian life. And he got to Rome, and a big city, and he saw the laxity of the priests and also the living style of Pope Leo X, who himself said to his cousin Giulio, who would follow him in the papacy, "God has given us the papacy, let's enjoy it," whatever that means. I'm not quite sure. But anyway, what really scandalized him most of all was the selling of indulgences. This is a picture. We see the Pope and the cardinals here, and this is the faithful coming in, laying their money on the table. And it just wasn't selling them. The people were presented with a certificate saying their sins were forgiven. Now, we understand indulgences. The church believes in indulgences today, but indulgences, we believe, in a general sense, if you do certain prayers or certain good works or certain penance, let's say, you can lessen the time you may have to suffer in purgatory. But in this case, they were giving them certificates to saying, you're forgiven your sins. And some in the church were worried that people would stop going to confession to confess their sins. They would just pay and buy forgiveness. And having a certificate in those days was pretty important. Most people didn't read. They probably didn't even know what it said, but said, I got this certificate, said that I was forgiven sins. Most people were illiterate. They didn't have things that were written in those days, even in the Renaissance, although this would be the period shortly after this that the printing press would come about. I didn't have that in my lecture, but the printing press would accelerate the Reformation. So Luther was scandal, and he went back to Wittenberg. And, well, let me just follow my notes right here. In Protestant circles, now Leo is associated with granting indulgences. And the reason they were selling these certificates of indulgence was to finance the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica. That's the present basilica that's in Rome today. So Luther went back and he looked up, he compiled a list of 95 theses. In other words, he challenged the church on 95 points. You can find all of them online just by Googling 95 theses of Luther. They'll come up, every one of them. And he posted it, and he challenged the church. Of course, the popes thought, who is this guy? You know, he's not a cardinal, he's not a bishop, he's not renowned, a famous theologian. So they ignored him. So Leo refused to acknowledge his legitimacy. But he did, because it started to cause quite a stir in northern Europe, in Germany in particular. So the Pope came out with a papal bull called Exsurge Domini, which means rise up, O Lord. And he condemned Martin Luther's stance, and he felt that he was so adamant, Luther, that he wasn't being reasonable, that this was blocking off communication. But most people agree that Leo himself didn't take Martin Luther seriously. So on the 10th, on June 15th, the Pope Leo the 10th, he sent out a part of this bull was censuring 41 of Luther's 95 theses. And he challenged, he told Luther that unless he recanted, he would be excommunicated. In other words, there was no debate that you either recant or you face excommunication. Luther's response was to respond by publicly burning the papal bull. So that was a challenge. He was excommunicated in 1521, and that was the year Leo X died. Some historians believe that Leo never took Luther seriously, and even till the time that he had died. Okay. And they said that if he had more interest in artwork than the Reformation, if he took religion more seriously, we wouldn't have had the Reformation. But I'm sure that the church needed reform at that time, and this is how it was manifested. Luther was also given protection by the German princes, especially Frederick the Wise of Saxony. The German princes here saw an opportunity, because they were at odds with the church, because a lot of the revenue that was collected by the church was going to Rome for the building projects and that, and they saw that they could have that money if, for example, they had control over the church. It was that old problem of lay investiture that we spoke about several lectures ago. All those things had to do with raising money in one form or another. So Luther probably, scholars say, he really never initially wanted to break from the church, but once he was excommunicated and he was hidden away, because then the church actually censured him and demanded he come to Rome and face a tribunal, right, a inquisition, in other words. So he wasn't going to do that. Because the church was known at the time for executing, burning people at the stakes. Like John Huss in Czechoslovakia, he was a priest who came to Rome when he disagreed with the church, and they burned him at the stake. That's why there's a lot of anti-clericalism in parts of Czechoslovakia today, going back to those days. And this was just preceded Luther, so he wasn't going, and he got protection from the German princes. Okay. So, it brings us to Pope Clement. Sorry about this. Here we go. Pope Clement VII. Clement was the cousin of Leo X, Giulio de' Medici. He was the son of Lorenzo's brother, who was assassinated in the Cathedral of Florence during High Mass, and the signal for the assassination. They were trying to assassinate all the Medicis, was the consecration, the elevation of the host. But Lorenzo de' Medici was able to jump over the altar and escape through the sacristy. Some bishops were involved in that, and Lorenzo finally brought them to his own justice and hung them from the Piazza della Signoria, that palace building in the square in Florence. It was cruel days, brutal days. Clement, though, was a hapless person, just like his cousin. Probably really shouldn't have been in the church hierarchy. But let's see what happened. I just have an image here. I spoke of this Castel Sant'Angelo. It's a favorite place for the popes to take refuge when the city is being under attack. Boniface XIII took refuge here against Henry IV, and so did Clement. Now this gets a little complicated here because we're going to move. We've got, we saw the causes, the basic causes of the Lutheran revolt. Now we're going to look at the English breakaway of the Church of England. Castel Sant'Angelo, if you're familiar with Rome, it's just down a couple of hundred yards down outside the Vatican. And it was a castle in those days, but it's originally the tomb of the Emperor Hadrian. It's known as Hadrian's tomb, or Castel Sant'Angelo. So Clement VII had to take refuge there, and we'll see. Anyway, his reign was a rapid succession of political, military, and religious struggles, which had far-reaching consequences for the church and politics at the time. You see, Clement inherited Martin Luther's Reformation. At that time, there was also a power struggle in Italy between the King of France, Francis I, and the King of the Roman Empire, the Holy Roman Empire, Charles V. Charles V was the nephew of Catherine of Aragon. Catherine of Aragon was the wife of Henry VIII, his first wife. And she was also the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella. But Ferdinand and Isabella, which I know you're all familiar with Columbus, and they were deceased at this time. But that was her nephew. And both of them were trying to get the Pope on their side in their battle. And Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, would come down into Rome. And we'll see about that in just a moment. There also was going on a Turkish invasion of Eastern Europe. In other words, the Turks had come up through the Balkans, and they would siege Vienna. They made something over the next couple centuries at 4 tries to take Vienna. They never succeeded, and they finally ceased. And that's as far as Islam got, spreading from the east, coming in the west. And I had mentioned that 2 lessons ago, that Charles Martel, Charlemagne's grandfather, had stopped the Muslim advance coming up to Spain, because Spain had been under Muslim domination until 1492. It was Ferdinand and Isabella who then dispelled the Muslims from Spain and turned it back into a Christian nation. So we have Clement's problems that were also exacerbated by King Henry VIII of England, who now wanted, I had put down divorce, but he was asking for an annulment. He wanted an annulment because his wife Catherine had previously been married to his brother Arthur. They were both married very young. Arthur was 16 and she was about 17. They were married for 6 months. They had no children, and Catherine said the marriage wasn't consummated, which meant under church law then that she could marry his brother. See, in those days, you couldn't marry the widow of your brother if the marriage had been consummated and they had children. So there was no impediment to the marriage between Henry and Catherine, even though she was the widow of the brother, because there were no children. And in addition, we'll see that they got a dispensation from Pope Julius II, just in case. But Henry said, that in other words, that he was cursed with God. Let me just bring up this here. So Henry claimed that the lack of a male heir was because his marriage was blighted in the eyes of God. Catherine was his brother's widow, and the marriage was childless. Moreover, Pope Julius gave him the dispensation. So now Henry argued that this had been wrong. He shouldn't have had a dispensation. So the marriage is not legal. Okay. Now, the Pope was in a difficult situation. Poor Clement. Right? He was a prisoner of Charles V, the nephew of Catherine, in Castel Sant'Angelo when this request came in. So if he granted it, he would have been offending the one who's holding him prisoner. Right? We don't think that that's really the reason. The reason was that he was following church law, and there was no grounds for the annulment. So he turned down he refused the request of Henry VIII. Okay. However, the Archbishop of Canterbury, his name was Thomas Cranmer, he was prepared, in spite of the Pope's objections, to give the annulment to Henry, and he did. Henry then married Anne Boleyn. Right? That was the second of 6 wives he would have. Right? The Pope responded by excommunicating both Henry VIII and the Archbishop of Canterbury, Cranmer. So, what did Henry do? He passed through the Parliament. At this time, Parliament was active. Several acts or several laws. The first was known as the Acts of First Fruits and Tenths. That means taxes on the ecclesiastical income were diverted from the Pope to the English crown. See, it always gets back to money somehow or other, right? And another act was Peter's Pence, which outlawed the annual payment by landowners of 1 penny to the Pope. All landowners, so they added up to something. The act also stated that England had no superior under God, but only your grace, and that Henry's imperial crown was diminished by the unreasonable and uncharitable usurpations of the Pope. And ultimately, the Act of Supremacy that established the Anglican Church, or the Church of England, breaking away from the Catholic Church. So both those popes dealt with situations that they really, outside circumstances, made it difficult for them, but also they weren't really competent enough. They were both hapless popes. The popes in those days, some of them that preceded these popes, were very well educated. They had either doctor's degrees in canon law from the University of Paris, the University of Bologna, great schools in theology that Thomas Aquinas himself had taught with a century or so before this time. And some of the great, St. Albert the Great, was taught at the University of Paris. But both of these Medici popes were schooled in the Medici Palace in Florence. Now, it doesn't mean they had a bad education, but they really didn't have the kind of education they needed. Lorenzo de' Medici brought many scholars into his circle, philosophers, poets, and of course the great painters, Da Vinci and Michelangelo at one time or another, were all part of this coterie that surrounded Lorenzo de' Medici, and they tutored these young men. They would have been ideal somewhere in in the realm of royalty and that, but to lead the church during these trying times, it was a misfortune. So that's how history plays out, though. Now, okay. I jumped ahead here. Okay, here we go. All right, so we're going to go into the modern times, history of the modern times. There's no date in the history of the papacy that says this is the modern times. I took an arbitrary date, and I'll tell you why. I took the year 1870, during the reign of Pius IX. 1870 was an important year. We had seen on some of the maps previously that Italy had always been divided up throughout history, through the Middle Ages, coming down over the centuries. And there was, in this time, a movement to unify the whole Italian peninsula under a kingdom. And they were pretty successful in bringing in one region after another. But they had right in the middle the Papal States, right from the Adriatic coast to the Mediterranean coast, coming down right across kind of from northeast to southwest. So it divided the whole peninsula. Of course, this new kingdom wanted those Papal States. And the year 1870 became the year. They had, this time, been giving the papacy quite a bit of trouble, and Napoleon III stepped in and sent French troops to defend the city of Rome. Remember, the city of Rome was run by the Pope. It was part of the Papal States. Now, the Kingdom of Italy had taken over some of the northern provinces of the Papal States, but they hadn't taken Rome yet. Well, the Franco-Prussian War broke out in 1870. Think of Bismarck and the Prussian, right? At that time, this was that age when Germany was also unifying. Germany was unified the next year, 1871. What had happened, Napoleon had to pull his troops out of Rome and to put them into the war against the Prussians. So it was the opportunity for the Italian army to siege Rome. Now they sieged Rome again. Okay. So the result was the annexation of the Papal States to the Kingdom of Italy. The next year they had a plebiscite and the people voted for it. Much like when the Russians took over Crimea, and after they took it over, they had a plebiscite and the people voted to be annexed by Russia. This is the same situation, but a little differently. In those days, the people wanted to be part of the movement. It was the era of nationalism. That's when nationalism became dominant on the world stage. Okay. So the popes had ruled over a temple state since the time of Pippin the Short. And that came out to 1,100 years. 1 millennium plus 100 years, the popes were leaders of armies involved in wars and all sorts of alliances and all involvements in ruling large territory with large populations. I think it was great. This is my personal feeling, and I know the feeling of many others, that losing the Papal States is one of the best things that could have happened to the papacy and the church. Right? The attention and the resources of the church could now be shifted from the temporal world to the spiritual world. First, the popes didn't realize this. They were really, mad at the Italians for taking it away. The popes, the next 3 popes or so, never left the Vatican, stayed in it, because they refused to recognize this new Italian government. Okay, so that would be then, the popes were not happy with the Italians. They would not recognize the state until 59 years later. Now, what happened 59 years later? Okay, Mussolini signs a pact with Gaspari there. This is, by the way, 1929 San Francisco Chronicle, the Lateran Pact. They signed an agreement. Gaspari was the Cardinal Gaspari, Secretary of State for the Vatican. They signed a historic pact. And what did that pact say? It's, well, here's a picture here, and this is Mussolini, and this is Cardinal Gaspari. This is at the Lateran Pact. palace next to St. John the Lateran Church, which is the seat of the See of Rome. That's the church of the Pope. That's where he rules from. Although the popes now, since the Renaissance, have been living in St. Peter's, okay, because they want to be close to the remains of St. Peter's and the tradition of where he was martyred, right there. But this is the diocesan cathedral, if I can put it in that language. All right. So they, what it amounted to, that the papacy would recognize the state of Italy, and the state of Italy would recognize the sovereignty of the Vatican City, which is a territory of about 109 acres, with full independence for the Pope. They did, at this time, also pay compensation for confiscating the papal states of about 750 million lira. I tried to figure it out at what the lira was worth in those days, and it came out to about $130 million. A lot of money in a lot of money today. But and anyway, they got some bonds from the Italian government also. This here is the Vatican City. So this now 109 acres is the only responsibility for the Pope. And his army now is just a remnant, right? The papal guards that are really more internal security. By the way, this is St. Peter's Square, and there is no borders to cross. I mean, there's a border, but there's not any obstacles or checkpoints, right? Many of you have been there. You can just walk from Italy right through the double colonnades. This represents the double colonnades, Bernini's colonnade. You can walk right in St. Peter's Square. There are kind of the field stones that give the outline. You step over, say, I'm in Vatican City. You step this way, and I'm in the city of Rome. Right? Those of you that have been to the Vatican Museum, and the Sistine Chapel, the entrance is right here, and if there's any lines, you go right along the wall. This wall, by the way, was built in 800 to prevent the Muslims from sacking. The Muslims sacked the first St. Peter's. They come up just like we talked about the Normans coming up the Seine to attack Paris. Well, the Muslims came up the Tiber from the coast, went in and desecrated the first St. Peter's Basilica that Constantine built, 800, before the new one. So that's when that wall was built. And this gives us once you're in here, this is the Vatican Library and the museum that you go down. This is the Sistine Chapel. Actually, you go around and then you go back out the same way, kind of right near where you come in. Sistine Chapel. These were the papal apartments in those days, and that's where the 5 rooms of Raphael are, just before you go into the Sistine Chapel. Today, these are the papal apartments. This is the window where the Pope appears over the people in St. Peter's Square. That's the window he comes to. Pope Francis, does not live in the papal apartments. You know that, right? Okay. He lives in this house here of St. Margaret. I forget what they call it, like a retreat house or something. He lives there because he doesn't want to be influenced. See, there's still politics. He doesn't want to be under the control of certain cliques in the Vatican. All right? It's human life. It's human life. These kind of things happen in the world. And that's why he keeps aloof from them. But he does appear up at the window sometime. But he doesn't live there. Okay. Let's go. Let's look at Pius IX. He is the Pope who was reigning in 1870. A couple of things about him. First of all, he was the longest reigning Pope. He reigned for 32 years. They say he was unsuccessful politically because he lost the Papal States. I think that's a blessing. Okay, he oversaw the loss of the Papal States, but he was successful theologically. On December 8th, that date rings a bell to you, I know it does, he declared the Immaculate Conception of the Blessed Virgin Mary, that she was preserved from sin from the first moment of her conception. Let's talk about that very briefly, because it's important to Catholics. Right? The belief that Mary was pure and free from sin dates back to the earliest church. As a matter of fact, in the Declaration, they said it's the apostolic teaching, even though it wasn't declared. But they had a hard time defining it because Christ's redemption came after Mary was conceived and born. Right? So how did that work? How could she have been? Because as a human, even St. Thomas Aquinas said, and St. Thomas Aquinas now was a century and a half before this, right, that even Mary was subject, right, to the effects of original sin. In other words, even she had to bear the burden of original sin. However, how did it come about that they defined it as they did? It was thanks to a Franciscan theologian, also about the time of Aquinas, a little after him. His name was Duns Scotus. It's Duns Scotus. Yeah, I spelled it wrong. John Duns Scotus, right? That just means John Duns, the Scotsman. He was from Scotland, and when Scotland was a Catholic country. And he taught at the University of Paris. He would actually be expelled in it. If you go to last week, remember the conflict between Pope Boniface VIII and Philip IV of France, and the Unam Sanctam, where the Pope says, the Pope is above everybody, and then Philip came into Rome and imprisoned the Pope, kept him prisoner for 3 days, then he died after that. And then Duns Scotus sided with the Pope, so they kicked him out of the University of Paris, which was a Catholic university. Okay. And what he said was, he explained, matter of fact, he wrote a whole treatise on it. You can find it online if you're interested in reading about it. And he had to present that to the Curia, right, before they made this determination. But basically he explained that the conception, right, came through God's application of grace of Christ beforehand. In other words, it was known by God that the redemption would come about. So we could explain it that it was effective retroactively. Okay, they didn't use that word, but this is what it means. In other words, Christ, living God, doesn't live in time and space. And his act of salvation is universal, infinite in time, so it was able to be applied to Mary. Okay? That's basically how it came about. That's how they affirmed the papal. But they said it was now the teachings of the apostles, to go back that far. He also declared the doctrine of papal infallibility. Now that also comes from the beginning of the church. It's not new. It's not a new doctrine. They always believed that the Pope was free from error. But let's look at it, you see, because they define it here. It's a dogma that the church states that in virtue of the promises of Jesus that we talked about in the first lesson, quoting all the scriptures that Jesus had said to give primacy to Peter, right? The Pope is preserved from the possibility of error. When? Now, as soon as you hear the word when, you see it's a limitation. It's not universal. It's limited. And that is when in the exercise of his office as shepherd or teacher of Christians. Right? And when he defines doctrine concerning faith or moral. Let's look at a little bit closer. Papal infallibility does not mean that the Pope cannot make mistakes. Of course he makes mistakes. But the dogma meant, by the way, it was meant to protect church teachings, existing church teachings. It's not meant for the Pope just to make new teachings. See? It's to protect the teachings from the apostles. There's new ways of explaining old truths, though. Okay? And that's what it really amounts to. Okay? So they say officially when this Pope speaks ex cathedra, which means cathedra, of course, from the Greek to the Latin means seat of authority. It actually also means chair, like a throne. When he's speaking in the position of authority, right, and when he is in the discharge of his office as shepherd and teacher, and by virtue of a supreme apostolic authority, he must be defining doctrine of faith and morals. That's to fine-tune it. That's the limitation. So the Pope can make mistakes in press conferences, over dinner, giving a speech, or otherwise. He has to be saying, I'm sitting here from the seat of authority to declare church teachings. And once he does that, he is within the limitations of papal infallibility. But it was now declared by him. Okay, let's move on to Pius XII, 260th Pope, 1939 to 1950. He's the Pope I grew up under, at least until I was about 16 years old. And that's what we really knew as the Pope in those days. His name was Eugene Maria Giuseppe Pacelli. A lot of times he was referred to as Pope Pacelli. He was born of a very aristocratic old Roman family, had very close, for generations, close ties to the Vatican. It was his father, his uncles, his brothers. They were all involved with banking for the papacy. His father started the Vatican newspaper, L'Osservatore Romano, and his brother was a lawyer, worked on with Pacelli and Cardinal Gaspari on updating the Code of Canon Law back in the 1920s. Okay, after his ordination then, he never became a pastor or a priest, a parish priest. He was sent right to the Vatican. And he was helping Cardinal Gaspari revise the Code of Canon Law. Later he became papal nuncio to Bavaria, I think in 1917, right after the First World War. He was sent to Germany. He loved German culture. They say he died listening to Beethoven. He liked German music, and he liked German food. That's unusual for an Italian to like German food, but believe me, I know that. But I like German food. In any case, he returned to Rome and was elevated by a cardinal and made papal Secretary of State. In other words, he replaced Gaspari, the one who signed the Lateran Pact. Okay, he traveled widely when he was Secretary of State, very widely. He traveled more than any other Secretary of State up to that time. Traveled to the United States. He was on good terms with President Roosevelt. President Roosevelt, they used to write letters during the war, and they used to upset the Vatican because the Roosevelt used to break protocol. He would always sign the letters, "Your friend." Okay, that's they always forgive the Americans for not following protocol. Okay, that's what the Times said. Pacelli elected Pope's 63rd birthday, named on the 4th ballot. He was elected on the 3rd ballot, and he asked for another vote just to make sure. There wasn't any doubt. Voted again. Okay, and they said they expect him to continue strong policies. 1939, outbreak of war. We know it because 1938, Hitler marched into the Sudetenland and took over that part of Czechoslovakia. It was annexed. Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister, went and said, "We'll have peace. Will they allow the Germans to do this?" That was the big fault of Chamberlain at Munich. Right? That's a famous point in history. We have peace now. He came back to England. A few months, in the next year, 39, I don't have the month here, but Hitler marches in, takes over all of Czechoslovakia, and then in the same year, about 3 months after Pacelli was elevated to the papacy, Hitler marches on Poland and World War II. That brought Russia in. It brought French, who had an alliance with the Russians, and then it brought the British into the war, who had an alliance with the French. World War II started, 1939, with the invasion of Poland. We wouldn't be in, of course, till 41, right? Late November 41, December, after Pearl Harbor. Okay. So Pacelli was very controversial pope. Right? He reigned during all of World War II. He reigned during the rise and the fall of fascism, Nazism, also fascism, right? He reigned during the Holocaust. And the rise of communism. So in the eyes, right, and all eyes were on his behavior. In 1963, a play by Rolf Hochschild called The Deputy. Have anyone heard of The Deputy? Okay. Well, very anti-clerical, anti-papal anyway. He portrayed Pius as having failed to take action to speak against the Holocaust, and what he really portrayed him was as a Nazi sympathizer. Now, I talked before about judging people, right? Last week I said when you go back in history, you try to judge people. You have to put yourself in the context of the time. Pacelli, right, was the leader, and if you study it and on the face of it, he did never really come out and condemn the Holocaust and the Nazis. although he did come out with an encyclical when the Germans invaded Russia in 1940, June of 41. He did come out with an encyclical where he condemned it, but he didn't name specifics. So the Nazis knew it was them, but they didn't take offense because he didn't name Hitler or call them Nazis or anything. Why? Because he was a diplomat. Also, he knew that under Nazi control was something like 60 million Catholics living, and he was worried about them. He also felt that communism, which was an atheistic belief, was more hostile or more dangerous than the Nazis were. It was a judgment. In hindsight, we could say, well, is it? He was afraid that if the Germans lost, the Soviets would come in and take over Eastern Europe and put them under atheism, because communism, right, part of it is to be an atheist. As a matter of fact, they would come out just before Pius XII that anyone who joined the Communist Party is excommunicated. So we have all these considerations to think about. Plus, in 1943, when Mussolini, when the Italians surrendered and they assassinated, the Italians killed Mussolini, the Nazis took over Rome. Germans took over Rome. On top of that, let's just look at a couple things that he really did. There was another book come out in 1999 by a British journalist entitled Hitler's Pope. Right. There was also a book that came out by a rabbi saying the myth of Hitler's Pope, and how the Pope Pius XII rescued Jews from the Nazis. Many Jews were hidden in the Vatican. He ordered all the convents and monasteries in Italy to open up, and they took Jews in. The church also issued baptismal certificates for them, gave them, false baptismal, so they could save their lives. The Italian government, after they got rid of Mussolini, also issued birth certificates that said they weren't Jews. No, it didn't have Judaism on it and that kind of thing. The Italians, one of the countries that never officially turned the Jews over, that happened in France and in Poland and the other countries where they actually turned the Jews over to the Nazis. The Italians were as devious as possible. They said they're Jews, but they're our Jews. Okay, I heard this at the Holocaust Institute from a series of lectures given by different Jewish professors who, when the one came to Italy, I was concerned being Italian descent, and I was so happy it was the only country that didn't do it. But the Vatican did a lot. When the war was over and they opened the convents and the monasteries, there was thousands, about 5,000 Jews were being given shelter and refuge there. Okay, in addition, okay, a couple other books come out. This one is about the Pope's last crusade against this refers to his predecessor, the 11th, though. But the Church of Spies, the Pope's war against Hitler, a secret war against Hitler. This is about Pius XII. So there was a lot. I think there was a lot going on between Roosevelt. The problem today that this continues is because the Vatican just recently turned over, a couple of years back, a lot of the archives from the Vatican during this period, but they won't turn them all over. See, they're afraid. Well, what the critics are saying is he didn't speak out enough against the Holocaust, and he didn't do enough against the Holocaust. It's true. Why? Because he was afraid that if he did, it would just worsen things. Because it was bad enough, you see. Here. Okay.
Was Pope Pius involved or suspected of being involved in any
Okay.
assassination Hitler?
I'm sorry. Bill, let me hold the questions because I don't know if I'm going to make it. I'll get your question now. Okay, so this pretty much I covered. Oops. Okay, I don't know what that was. All right, in addition, this here was the chief rabbi in Rome. He was given shelter in the Vatican, and after the war he became a Catholic. There must have been a reason for that. Okay. Here's a site here. It's a public execution of Polish priests in the city of Bydgoszcz, I think it's pronounced, Old Market Square, 9 September 1939. They mowed all these priests down. These things were on the Pope's mind. Okay, here's Catholic priests in Dachau, right, a famous concentration camp. Okay, they're all Catholic priests, and they met the same faith that the Jews met. There were 3,000 clergy, right, priests, and there were some Protestant ministers too, but mostly Catholic priests that were killed. 3,000 is nothing compared to 6 million, but it's a lot. So we're going to leave it at that. The controversy continues. I think he's a great pope. There was a movement to beatify him, but they put it all on hold. I think he should, but there's a lot of controversy. They'll say that the church is supporting a Nazi sympathizer. That's what it would boil down to. Alienate people. There's big groups that are out against the Pope, that Pope. Let's look at Pope John the 23rd, 261st Pope, lovable. I call him Pope Angelo Giuseppe Roncalli. Okay. Roncalli was elected Pope when he was 77 years old, and he was considered a transition Pope. That's not an official description. Transition Pope, though, is one where the College of Cardinal has mostly old popes, and they don't have enough, cardinals. And there's not really that many cardinals. So they take an old pope, and they elect him, and he fills the College of Cardinals with new, younger bishops and elevates them to cardinal. And then when he dies, you've got more of a group that a pope can be elected from. He was a real peasant, though, with 13 in his family. He lived in a house where they had animals right on the ground floor of the house. He was drafted in the army, Italian army, became a sergeant. After he was ordained, then he went to the seminary, he was ordained. And when World War I broke out, he was called in and he was a chaplain. But after the war, he wanted nothing but to be a pastor. But he was called into the diplomatic corps, and he spent the first 15 years in Bulgaria, Greece, and then Istanbul. If you know right away, there he is. He's outside the church. He's in an Orthodox country and then in a Muslim country. And after the war, by the way, they brought him into France. That's prestigious because he was that good. And by the way, he was also a scholar of the church. But he had a wonderful sense of humor, right? When he would meet Jewish people, he would say to them, "Hi, I'm Joseph, your brother." Right? We know that from Joseph, the prophet in the Old Testament, when his brothers came to Egypt and he was associated with the Pharaoh. He said, "Hi, I'm Joseph, your brother." Okay. Also, once when visiting prisoners in Rome over Christmas, he said to them, "I remember when my uncle was in jail." So that just really, they became enamored of him, just such a, that's why I call him love. I just picked this out because this is an experience I had. I was in Rome there when I was in the military. I was in the Marines, and we were in St. Peter's with a group, and the Holy Father, we knew we were going to see the Holy Father, but St. Peter's Basilica was full. We were way in the back, and there was a Jewish sailor next to me. He told me I'm Jewish, he says, but I got a lot of Italian relatives. I said, "Well, buy them rosary beads, and I'll show you, how to get the papal blessing." And then I taught him the responses in Latin to the prayers that preface the apostolic blessing. And then all of a sudden, the doors of the back of the church open, and they're carrying in our Holy Father here on this seat. And I thought, we're not even going to see him. We're so far back in the basilica. And here he comes. He was from here to that wall from me, and I swear that his eyes met mine for one split second. Or maybe it was my imagination. But anyway, I was excited, but the Jewish sailor said to me, "I got chills all over." That's the impact this Roncalli had. Okay, what he's most famous for was calling the greatest council in the history of the modern church. Right? We all know, even though we don't stand here today and know all the documents and declarations that come out of this council. You can find them all online. Some of them are really worth reading. we all know, we witness in the liturgy every day, especially those of us who remember the old church where the priests had their back and the altar was against the wall and everything was turned around now, right? How you can take the Eucharist in your own hands and the cup in your hands, which we couldn't do in the old church. We see all of those changes and the whole ecumenicism, right? It was all about it. Okay, so John, right, he convoked this council, and it was totally unexpected, a total surprise. People were actually, stunned. 2,300 bishops came out, and during the whole conference of 2,800, there was no council in church history that ever come close to this. They sent out a few years before 1949, when he announced it, they sent out preliminary questionnaires, and those questionnaires went to the bishops and to theologians and those who had the need to know, and they come back and they filled 16 volumes, and each volume was about 500 pages. They had to narrow that down. Okay, we can't get into the council, but I had been in Rome when the seats were up. I remember St. Peter's in this configuration, but the council wasn't in session when I was there. Okay. He died on June 3rd from stomach cancer, and on his deathbed, he said, when they told him that he doesn't have long to live, he said, "Well, my bags are packed." Okay. That's typical John the 23rd. Okay. I got the wrong way. Okay. Pope John Paul, 264th Pope, 1978 to 2005. The great, right? We talked about the two greats in the second lecture, and he's up. By the way, there was a pope between them. Pope John Paul the first, but they called him the Smiling Pope. And there he is with his successor. That was Cardinal, hello? Okay. He was only Pope for 33 days. He's one of the few popes, modern popes, that I haven't seen, but I was in Rome the day he died, and the church bells were ringing like crazy. It was a Sunday, and I said, "Why are they ringing? The Pope died." I said, "You're kidding, he's just got elected, And they said, yeah. So it was really a sad day for all of us just to know that the Pope died. Anyway, John Paul was the first non-Italian Pope in 455 years. The other non-Italian Pope was the one, remember we just did the Renaissance Pope, and we talked about Clement VII. The one who succeeded Clement VII was the last. He was a Dutchman. So from that time to here, 455 years, he was the first and only, up to this time, the Slavic Pope. Okay? He was raised in occupied Poland during World War II. He lived under the communists most of his adult life. Okay? He was a participant, active in Vatican II. He pushed through a couple of issues himself as a bishop, and that the church should allow other dominations and religions to have the same level of freedom that she asked for herself. Okay, religious freedom, part of human dignity, which is the name of one of the papal encyclicals at the time. Okay, the church, and he also wanted the church to teach the proper relationship between God and humans. That was all these things were spelled out. He traveled quite a bit. He met the Patriarch of Constantinople, Demetrius. He's the first to apologize for the act of 1054 when Cardinal Humbert slammed down during Mass the bull of excommunication to the Orthodox Patriarch. He was the first one to meet a British monarch as the head of the Church of England. He met Muslims. He apologized for the Crusades, the brutality of the Crusades. And he met with Jews in Palestine and apologized for the harsh treatment of Christians over the centuries. He also met the Dalai Lama. Okay, we're just about out of time. So let me just end it. There was an assassination attempt on his life. And he actually forgave. That's the person who tried to assassinate him. He then was sent back. He was a Turk. His name was Mehmet Ali Aksa. Mehmet is the Turkish for Muhammad. So Muhammad Ali Aksa. Right, Pope forgave him after he served some years in prison in Italy. Pope asked for leniency. They sent him to Turkey to finish his time. When Pope John II died, he came to Rome and placed flowers on his grave. He wanted to see Pope Francis, but they wouldn't let him because he does have some mental problems, okay? I like what he says here in this picture. It says, as families go, so goes the nation, so goes the whole wide world in which we live. Right? He was a true prince of reconciliation and, of course, ecumenicism. He changed the attitude of many non-Catholics and non-Christians toward the church. Okay. Well, I just want to tell you, our time has run out, but we did get through the popes I wanted to get through. I hope we can continue to isolate some of these popes we talked about and go into them in depth perhaps in the future, talk in depth about church councils and some of the documents they produce and how it has changed and affected the pope. Does anyone have any questions? Bill, did you have?
Yes, just about Pope Pius. Was it, I've heard that he was, it's suspected that he was involved in assassination plots against Hitler. Do you know anything about that?
Well, there's a lot of these books out, like Hitler's Pope, and they come out with all. That was Pope Pius the 12th, you said? Yeah, I never heard that, but I'm sure it's a lot. There's always a lot of rumors, like Pope John Paul I. They said he was possibly assassinated, and they come up with a whole conspiracy and how he was assassinated because he died after, but he was in ill health. He had some problems, you see. Yes?
With regards to Pope Pius XII, I know during the early years of Nazi Germany, Catholic bishops and priests came out against euthanasia. Do you know if Pope Pius XII said anything against that as well? Because I know that sort of convinced Hitler to back off.
No, no, I don't know for a fact exactly, specifically what you said, but a lot of things he said were turned around. You see, when the Nazis invaded Russia, he said in certain words, I can't quote them, but I'll give you I kind of paraphrase it, that it was a good thing. It was a good thing that they're fighting these atheists and communism to stop the spread. And then it was turned around that he's a Nazi sympathizer and he supports the Nazis. Now, but that wasn't his intent. It was quite clear, you see. When they interviewed people who knew Pius XII, you see, because he was a rather rigid person, his personality, they said he was the kindest, simplest, and he used to say, I want to come out and condemn him, but I fear for the retaliation. And he would say, because this reason or that reason. No, that's firsthand accounts from people. So, but yeah, they turn things around and they write books and all that. So, yes, Joe.
One of the nuns we had in grade school told us...
Wait, hold it, Joe. Go.
One of the nuns we had in grade school told us that Pope Pius XII had a certain mass said for the Germans at that time when Hitler came to power. But it was based on the fact what Hitler did for the people of Germany, putting him back to work and get a responsibility. This was before the Holocaust actually took place.
Okay.
That's
Well,
what we were told by the nuns.
yeah, well, he liked German culture and also anything he said good about German culture was right away turned around. You see, that's what that amounts to. Okay. Let's say a prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Let us honor our Blessed Mother as we end today. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. Thank you very much. And thank you to those who stood for all of my lectures. I appreciate it. It's good seeing you here. I hope to see you again.
Thank you.
God bless you all.